The year is 1876. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Dakota Territory, a lone wagon casts a desperate shadow against the setting sun. Inside, the air is thick with the metallic tang of blood and the gut-wrenching cries of new life. Emery O'Connell has just given birth to twin boys, a miracle in the heart of desolation. But her husband, the man who swore to protect her, sees only a curse. In a moment of chilling cruelty, he will make a choice that leaves her and her newborn sons to the mercy of the elements. This is not just a story of survival. It's a saga of betrayal, an unlikely salvation, and the brutal, untamed heart of the American West. The dust of Missouri had long since been replaced by the finer, more persistent grit of the plains. It coated everything in the O'Connells' small, canvas-covered wagon. The sacks of flour, the precious barrels of water Emery's worn gingham dress, and the lines etched around her husband Liam's mouth. They were lines that had not been there when they'd first set out, full of shared dreams of a homestead nestled in the green promise of the West. Now those lines were carved deep, mirroring the ruts their wagon wheels cut into the unyielding earth. Liam had changed. The journey had stripped him of his easy smiles and replaced them with a simmering resentment that often found its target in Emery. Her pregnancy, once a source of quiet joy, had become in his eyes a liability. Another mouth to feed before we've even turned a spade of our own soil, he'd grumbled more than once, his voice low and sharp as a shard of flint. Emery tried to hold on to the man she'd married, the one who'd wooed her with promises of a life built by their own hands. But that man was a ghost lost somewhere back on the muddy banks of the Mississippi. This man, this Liam of the Dakota Territory, was a stranger with cold eyes and a heart that seemed to shrink with every passing mile. Their small wagon train, once a bustling community of a dozen families, had dwindled to 4. The unforgiving land had claimed the others through sickness, broken axles, and broken spirits. Their closest companions now were the taciturn Miller family, and Silas Croft, a grizzled old trapper whose knowledge of the land had been their salvation more than once. Silas, with his kind, crinkling eyes, often found excuses to share a portion of his hunted game with Emery, a gesture of kindness that earned him a searing glare from Liam. "We don't need his charity," Liam had hissed one evening after Silas had left a brace of rabbits by their fire. "He looks at you with pity, Emery. Pity for being saddled with a man who can't provide." "He looks at me with kindness, Liam," Emery had retorted, her voice trembling but firm. "Something I've seen precious little of these past months." The argument had ended, as they all did, with Liam stalking off into the twilight, leaving Emery to the silence and the heavy, kicking life within her. The first pangs of labor came as a thunderstorm brewed on the horizon, the sky a bruised purple. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken dread. The other wagons had pushed on, eager to find shelter from the coming storm, leaving the O'Connells lagging behind, with a wobbly wheel Liam had been meaning to fix for a week. "It's starting," Emery gasped, her hands clutching her swollen belly. Liam's face, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was a mask of grim annoyance. Now, of all the damnable times, Emery now. There was no time to argue. No time for anything but the raw, primal agony of childbirth. Liam, clumsy and resentful, did little to help. It was a messy, brutal affair, under the flickering light of a single lantern, the canvas walls of the wagon offering scant protection from the howling wind and lashing rain. Hours later, as the storm retreated, leaving a washed, pre-dawn quiet, the first cry, tore through the air. A son, Emery, slick with sweat and blood, managed a weak, triumphant smile. But her body was not done. Another wave of contractions seized her fiercer than before. "Another one?" Liam's voice was incredulous, laced with a new, terrifying edge of despair. "God in heaven, are you trying to kill us all?" The second twin, smaller, but just as vocal, entered the world as the first rays of sun crested the horizon. 2 sons. Emery's heart, despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under, swelled with a fierce, protective love. She looked at their tiny red faces, their impossibly small fists, and saw not a burden, but a future. Liam saw only ruin. He stared at the 2 squalling infants with a look of utter desolation, as if they were a plague of locusts descended upon his last remaining stalk of wheat. He paced the small space in front of the wagon, his boots sinking into the mud, his mind a whirlwind of panicked calculations. 2 more mouths, twice the liability, half the chance of survival. His dream of a prosperous homestead, already so fragile, now seemed to shatter into a million impossible pieces. He stopped his pacing and looked at Emery. She was pale, her eyes fluttering shut, her strength completely spent. The ground around the wagon was a mess of bloody rags and afterbirth. She looked like she was dying, and in that cold, calculating corner of his mind, a monstrous thought took root. Perhaps she was. Perhaps they all were, if they stayed together. "Liam," Emery whispered, her voice barely audible. "Our boys. We need to name them." He didn't answer. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sudden, chilling resolve, he began to move. He rehitched the horse to the wagon, his movements quick and efficient. "Liam, what are you doing?" Emery's voice held a note of rising panic. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back onto the blood-soaked blankets. He came to the back of the wagon and looked down at her, his face a cold, impassive mask. "The wheel is fixed. I'm going on." "We're going on," she corrected, her heart beginning to pound with a terrifying premonition. "No, Emery," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I am. I can't. I won't be dragged down by this. I have to make it. For my own sake." The words were like a physical blow. "You can't," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "Liam, these are your sons, your own flesh and blood. They're a death sentence," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Out here, they're a death sentence. And you're too weak to travel. It's a mercy, Emery. A hard mercy, but a mercy nonetheless." He reached into the wagon and grabbed a sack of cornmeal and a single canteen of water. He placed them on the ground, just out of her reach. "That should last you a day. With any luck, Silas might come back for you." But his tone made it clear he didn't believe it. Tears streamed down Emery's face, mingling with the sweat and grime. "Liam, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. Don't leave us here to die." He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. He turned his back on his wife, and his newborn sons climbed onto the driver's seat of the wagon, and with a sharp crack of the reins urged the horse forward. Emery, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, managed to crawl to the edge of the wagon, her babies wailing beside her. She watched as the wagon, her home, her entire world, grew smaller and smaller, a disappearing speck on the vast, indifferent plains. The sound of its wheels faded, replaced by the cries of her hungry children and the deafening, soul-crushing silence of the desert. She was alone, left to die with her twin sons in her arms, under the vast, uncaring sky of the west. The sun, a merciless white eye in the vast blue canvas, climbed higher, beating down on the desolate landscape. For Emery, time had dissolved into a torturous cycle of her baby's cries and her own fading consciousness. The canteen Liam had left was nearly empty, its meager contents a cruel joke in the face of the oppressive heat. She had managed to pull her sons to her chest, their small, warm bodies a fragile anchor to a world that was slipping away. She hummed a lullaby, her voice a dry, rasping whisper, the melody, a ghost of a happier time. She was dying. She knew it with a certainty that was as stark and unyielding as the baked earth beneath her. Miles away, Hinto moved through the tall grasses like a shadow, a man of the Oglala Lakota. He knew this land not as a territory to be conquered, but as a living, breathing entity. He knew the language of the wind, the secrets of the stones, the subtle shifts in the air that spoke of coming rain or the presence of game. He was tracking a small herd of pronghorn, his movements patient and precise, his senses attuned to the rhythm of the wilderness. But today, the wind carried a different sound. It was faint, almost lost in the rustle of the prairie grass. A thin, reedy wail that was not of this land. It was a sound of distress, a sound of life struggling against the odds. It pricked at his awareness, a discordant note in the symphony of the plains. A coyote pup, perhaps separated from its mother. But as he listened, another deeper instinct stirred within him. This was different. He altered his course, his moccasined feet making no sound on the dry ground. He followed the cry, his eyes scanning the horizon. It led him to the faint, almost erased tracks of a wagon. White man's tracks. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, his expression hardening. The Wasichu brought nothing but trouble. They scarred the land, slaughtered the buffalo, and their presence was a constant festering wound on the heart of his people. His own heart bore the scars of their coming. He had lost his wife Tassina and their infant son to the coughing sickness that had swept through their winter camp 2 seasons ago, a sickness brought by a trader from the east. The memory was a cold, hard stone in his chest. He had no love for the settlers. He crested a small rise and saw them, a splash of faded color against the brown and ochre of the plains. A woman, her hair a tangle of sun-bleached straw, lay on a blood-stained blanket, and nestled against her were 2 impossibly small forms, the source of the mournful cries that had drawn him here. He approached with the cautious grace of a wolf, his eyes taking in every detail. The abandoned supplies, the woman's pulped, cracked lips, the shallow, rattling breaths she drew. He saw the twin infants, their faces red and wrinkled, their tiny mouths opening and closing in a desperate, silent plea. He saw the profound, shocking cruelty of the scene. Even among the harshest of enemies, to abandon a woman in childbirth with her newborns was an act of unimaginable barbarity. His first instinct was to turn away. This was not his fight. These were Wasichu. Their troubles were their own. He had his own people to think of, his own grief to carry. To help them would be to invite trouble into his life, into his camp. His people were already wary, their patience worn thin by broken treaties and the ever-encroaching tide of the settlers. He took a step back, his jaw set. But then one of the infants let out a particularly piteous cry, a sound that seemed to pierce through the wall of his bitterness. It was the sound of pure, helpless innocence, a sound so like the one his own son had made in his final fevered hours. The stone in his chest seemed to crack. He looked at the woman, at the faint rise and fall of her chest, at the fierce, albeit unconscious way she held her children. He saw not a wasichu, but a mother. He saw not an enemy, but a life being unjustly extinguished. His code of honor, the ancient laws of his people that dictated compassion for the helpless, warred with the hardened grief and anger in his soul. He knelt beside them, the scent of blood and desperation thick in the air. He gently touched the woman's forehead. It was hot, like a stone left too long in the sun. He uncorked his own water skin, made from the bladder of a buffalo, and let a few precious drops fall onto her lips. She stirred, a low moan escaping her throat. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with delirium. When they landed on him, a flicker of fear crossed her face. "Shh," he whispered, the sound soft and guttural. It was a Lakota word, a sound meant to soothe, but he knew she would not understand it. He offered her the water skin again, and this time she drank her thirst, a desperate, frantic thing. He then turned his attention to the infants. They were small, dangerously so. He knew little of caring for newborns, but he knew they needed milk and warmth. Their mother was in no condition to provide either. He looked up at the sky. The sun was at its zenith. They would not survive another day out here. He made his decision. It was a choice that went against every instinct of self-preservation, a choice that would likely bring him scorn and suspicion from his own people. But to leave them here would be to abandon a part of his own humanity. With a gentleness that belied his strong, weathered hands, he carefully lifted the two babies. They were lighter than he could have imagined, their small bodies fragile as birds' eggs. He wrapped them in their own blanket, then secured them in a makeshift carrier he fashioned from his spare robe, strapping them to his chest. Their cries subsided, soothed by the warmth and the rhythmic beat of his heart. Lifting the woman was more difficult. She was a dead weight, her body limp with exhaustion and dehydration. He managed to hoist her onto his horse, positioning her in front of him, her head lolling against his shoulder. He took one last look at the place of their abandonment, at the discarded canteen, and the blood-soaked ground. He felt a surge of cold fury towards the man who had done this. Then, turning his back on the scene of such profound cruelty, he urged his horse forward, not towards the hunting grounds, but back towards his camp. A long, slow journey with the fate of 3 strangers resting entirely in his hands. The whisper of the wind now carried not just the cries of the lost, but the quiet, determined hoofbeats of an unlikely savior. The journey to Hinto's camp was a fever dream for Emery. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the rhythmic sway of the horse, the solid warmth of the man who held her, and the faint whimpering cries of her sons. The world was a blur of sun-scorched plains and endless sky, her own thoughts, a tangled mess of grief, fear, and a flicker of disbelief that she was still alive. When they finally arrived, the camp was a collection of teepees arranged in a wide circle, smoke curling lazily into the twilight sky. The sight of Hinto riding in with a white woman and 2 infants sent a ripple of astonishment and suspicion through the community. Faces curious and wary peered out from the entrances of their homes. Children stopped their games to stare, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Hinto ignored the stares. He dismounted carefully, handing the bundled twins to an older woman with a weathered, compassionate face who had come forward to meet him. Her name was Wayaka, or Feather, and she was Hinto's aunt, a respected elder in the tribe. She looked from the infants to the barely conscious Emery, then to her nephew, her expression, a question he could not yet answer. He carried Emery into his own teepee. It was a simple, spacious dwelling, the air inside cool and smelling of sage and wood smoke. He laid her gently on a bed of soft buffalo robes. For days she hovered in a shadowy world between life and death. Wiyaka, with a knowledge of herbs and healing, passed down through generations, tended to her. She brewed teas from willow bark to fight the fever, and applied poultices of yarrow to her wounds. The twins too were in a precarious state. Wiyaka and the other women of the camp took turns caring for them, feeding them a thin broth of cornmeal and water, and later milk from a doe that one of the hunters had brought back. There was much murmuring and debate around the communal fires at night. To take in a white woman and her children was a risk. The soldiers at the nearby fort were a constant menacing presence, and any interaction with the settlers was fraught with danger. But the sight of the two helpless infants abandoned by their own kind had softened even the hardest hearts. An unspoken consensus was reached, for now they would be sheltered. Emery's first moment of true lucidity came with the sound of her babies crying. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she was disoriented, the conical shape of the teepee and the unfamiliar patterns painted on the hide walls confusing her. Then memory came rushing back. The birth, the rain, Liam's cold face, the wagon disappearing into the distance. A wave of despair so profound it was physically painful washed over her. Wiyaka, sensing her distress, entered the teepee and knelt beside her, offering her a bowl of warm broth. Emery shrank back, fear instinctively tightening her muscles. Wiyaka simply placed the bowl beside her and retreated, her movements calm and unthreatening. This became their routine. The women would bring her food and tend to her needs with a quiet, unobtrusive grace. They would bring her sons to her, laying them beside her on the soft robes. She would hold them, her tears falling silently onto their tiny faces, her heart a tangled knot of love and grief. Her fear of Hinto was the most acute. He was a powerful, imposing figure, his silence as vast and intimidating as the plains themselves. He would enter the teepee periodically, his presence filling the space. He would look at her, his dark eyes searching and unreadable, and then he would leave without a word. She didn't know if he was her captor or her savior. One afternoon, as she was strong enough to sit up, he came in and sat on the other side of the teepee, a small bundle in his hands. He began to work on it with a piece of sharpened bone, his fingers moving with a surprising dexterity. He was mending a tear in a small moccasin. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft scraping of bone against leather. Finally, Emery found her voice, a dry, rusty whisper. "Why?" Hinto didn't look up from his work. "Why what?" His voice was deep, resonant. "Why did you help me?" He paused, setting the moccasin aside. He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something beyond the stoic mask, a flicker of an old, deeper-seated pain. "The wind carried the cries of your children," he said simply. "No man with a heart could ignore such a sound." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was as much as he was willing to give. As the weeks turned into a month, Emery's strength returned. She began to move around the camp, a pale, silent ghost among the vibrant life of the Lakota people. She learned through observation. She watched the women scrape and tan hides, their laughter ringing out as they worked. She saw the men return from the hunt, their faces streaked with paint and pride. She observed the deep reverence they had for the land, for the buffalo, for the intricate web of life that sustained them. It was a world away from the grasping, relentless ambition of the world she had known. The language was a barrier, a wall between her and the people who had saved her. But other forms of communication emerged. A shared smile with a woman who showed her how to grind corn. A gesture of thanks to a young boy who brought her a wildflower. And with Hinto, a quiet understanding began to grow. He taught her words, pointing to objects and speaking their Lakota names. Mani for water, Peta for fire, Tipi for home. She was a clumsy student, her tongue tripping over the unfamiliar sounds, but he was a patient teacher. One evening as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, Hinto came to her. Her sons were sleeping soundly in a cradle board Wiyaka had made for them, their bellies full, their cheeks plump. "They need names," Hinto said, his voice soft. "A name gives a person their place in the world." Emery looked at her sons, her heart aching with a love that was now tinged with a strange new kind of hope. The names she might have chosen, names like James or Thomas, felt like they belonged to another life, another world. They didn't fit these boys born in a storm and saved by a miracle. "You should name them," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You saved them. You gave them a life they would not have had." Hinto was taken aback. To name a child was a great honor, a great responsibility. He looked at the two sleeping infants, so alike, yet subtly different. He considered them for a long time, the firelight flickering on his thoughtful face. He pointed to the slightly larger of the two, the firstborn. "This one," he said, "we will call him Wanbli for the eagle. He was born in the face of a storm, and the eagle is the master of the storm." Then he turned to the second twin, the smaller, quieter one. "And this one," he continued, a rare, gentle smile touching his lips. "We will call him Hoka the badger. He is small, but his cry was strong enough to cross the plains. The badger is small, but fierce and determined. He will have a strong heart." Wanbli and Hoka, eagle and badger. The names felt right. They felt true. In that moment, something shifted in Emery's soul. The grief for the life she had lost did not disappear, but it made room for something new to grow. A tentative trust, a fragile sense of belonging. She was no longer just Emery O'Connell, the abandoned wife. She was the mother of Wanbli and Hoka, a woman living on the edge of two worlds under the protection of a man whose heart she was beginning to realize was as vast and as complex as the land itself. 2 years passed. The seasons turned, painting the plains in the pale greens of spring, the rich golds of summer, and the stark whites of winter. For Emery, or Winyan Washte, good woman as some had come to call her, the rhythm of Lakota life had become her own. Her skin, once pale and delicate, was now tanned and weathered by the sun and wind. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused from scraping hides and gathering roots. She had learned the language not perfectly, but well enough to share jokes with Wiyaka and to sing lullabies to her sons in the soft, guttural tones of the Lakota tongue. Wanbli and Hoka were no longer fragile infants, but sturdy, adventurous toddlers. They were a delightful paradox with their mother's bright blue eyes and hair the color of corn silk. Yet they moved with the confident grace of the Lakota children they played with. They called Hintoate, or father, and their bond was one of deep, unspoken affection. Hinto in turn saw in them a chance to heal the wound that had been festering in his heart for so long. He taught them to track rabbits, to recognize the calls of different birds, and to treat the land with the respect it deserved. He was a father again, and the joy of it had softened the hard lines around his eyes. Emery and Hinto's relationship had deepened into a quiet, powerful partnership. It was a bond forged not in whispered promises and romantic declarations, but in shared labor, mutual respect, and the silent understanding of two people who had found solace in each other's company. There was a love between them, a love as patient and as resilient as the prairie grass that always grew back after a fire. But the world of the Wasatchu was never far away. The iron horse now screamed across lands that had once belonged to the buffalo, and the blue-coated soldiers from Fort Laramie grew more numerous and more arrogant with each passing season. The Lakota people felt the pressure, the slow, relentless squeezing of their world. And in that world, Liam O'Connell still existed. He had not found the prosperity he had so callously sought. His journey west had been a cascade of failures. The land he had finally claimed was arid and unforgiving, and his lack of skill as a farmer quickly became apparent. His ambition, untempered by compassion or wisdom, had curdled into a bitter, resentful poison. He had drifted from one failed venture to another. A prospector, a mule skinner, a scout for the army, a job he lost due to his drunkenness and violent temper. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of his own choices, a spectre of failure drifting through the boom and bust towns of the frontier. He rarely thought of Emery. When he did, it was with a flicker of guilt quickly extinguished by the self-serving justification that he had done what was necessary to survive. He assumed she and the infants had perished within days, a tragic but unavoidable consequence of their harsh reality. Then one dusty afternoon, in a saloon in Cheyenne, he overheard a conversation that would change everything. A group of traders were talking about their dealings with the Lakota, complaining about their stubbornness and pride. One of the traders, a man named Henderson, mentioned a strange rumor he'd heard from a friendly half-breed scout. "Craziest thing I ever heard," Henderson slurred, wiping beer foam from his mustache. "They say there's a white woman living with Hinto's band of Oglala. Been with them for a couple of years now. Got 2 little boys with her. Blonde hair, blue eyes," the scout said. Can you imagine that Liam, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey in a dark corner, went cold? Blonde hair, blue eyes, 2 boys. The whiskey glass trembled in his hand. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A wild coincidence. But the seed of a thought, a dark and obsessive thought, had been planted. He sought out the trader, plying him with questions disguised as idle curiosity. Where was this Hinto's band usually camped? How reliable was this scout? The more he learned, the more the impossible began to seem terrifyingly real. His first feeling wasn't joy or even remorse. It was a surge of possessive rage. She had survived, and in surviving, she had made him a fool. She had lived, and he had failed, and the sons, his sons. He had abandoned them as a burden, but now a new, twisted idea began to form in his mind. 2 sons. Land grants were often larger for men with families. A man with 2 sons was a man of substance, a man with a legacy. They were no longer a liability. They were an asset that had been stolen from him. He had to find them. He had to reclaim what was his. His journey back into the heart of the Dakota Territory was fueled by a feverish obsession. He was no longer the aimless drifter. He was a man with a purpose, albeit a dark and twisted one. He even managed to find a trace of his past, a link to the life he had abandoned. In a small trading post near the Black Hills, he ran into none other than Silas Croft. The old trapper was weathered and frail, his eyes dimmer than Liam remembered. He didn't recognize Liam at first, and when he did, his face hardened with a look of pure contempt. "O'Connell," Silas rasped, his voice full of gravel. "I thought the buzzards would have picked your bones clean long ago. What in God's name are you doing in this part of the country?" Liam, putting on a mask of weary regret, told a carefully crafted story. He spoke of his despair, of his belief that Emery was too weak to survive, of his tortured conscience. "I went back, Silas," he lied, his voice thick with false emotion. "I swear I did. I went back the next day. But they were gone. I thought the wolves had taken them." Silas stared at him, his gaze unwavering. He had been the one to go back. He had found the blood-soaked ground and the abandoned canteen. He had followed the wagon tracks for a day before losing them, and had spent weeks searching his heart, heavy with the grim certainty of their fate. He didn't believe a word Liam said. "What do you want, O'Connell?" Silas asked, his voice cold. "I heard a rumor," Liam said, leaning in his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "A rumor of a white woman and 2 boys living with the Sioux. I have to know, Silas. I have to know if it's them." Silas's mind reeled. Could it be possible? Could Emery and her babies have survived? A flicker of hope, long extinguished, sparked within him. If it were true, she would be with people who had shown her kindness. A kindness Liam was incapable of. His first instinct was to protect her, to send Liam on a wild goose chase. But he also saw the dangerous glint in Liam's eye, the obsessive fire. If he didn't tell him, Liam would find out another way, and his arrival might be a violent, unexpected shock. Perhaps if Silas could control the information, he could somehow warn her. It was a dangerous gamble. Torn and uncertain, Silas made a fateful decision. He gave Liam a general idea of where Hinto's band might be found in the rolling hills near the Powder River. "But you be careful, O'Connell," he warned, his voice low and serious. "Those are proud people. You don't just walk in there making demands." Liam gave him a reassuring smile, a chillingly convincing performance. "I just want my family back, old friend. I just want to atone for my sins." As Liam rode out, his heart pounding with a dark and triumphant energy, Silas Croft was left with a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had unleashed a wolf, and he prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, that the woman and her sons would have the strength to survive its coming. The shadows of the past were gathering, and they were stretching long and menacing towards a peaceful camp by the Powder River. The first sign of trouble was a dead buffalo. Hinto and 2 other hunters found it lying in a shallow creek bed, its great, shaggy head submerged in the water. It hadn't been killed for its meat or its hide. It had been shot and left to rot, a gesture of pure, wasteful contempt. It was a Wasatchu act, a warning, an insult. Hinto felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The soldiers from the fort were growing bolder, but this felt different, more personal. A few days later, a young boy out checking rabbit snares came running back to the camp, his eyes wide with fear. He had seen a lone white man on a ridge overlooking their valley, watching them through a looking-glass. The camp was on alert. The men kept their weapons close, and the women kept the children near the teepees. Emery felt a familiar icy dread creep up her spine. She tried to dismiss it as a reaction to the general tension, but a deeper, more personal fear took hold. She found herself scanning the faces of her sons, their bright, innocent eyes, and her heart ached with a fierce, protective love. Hinto saw the fear in her eyes. He came to her as she was grinding corn outside their teepee-wanbli and Hoka playing at her feet. "Do not be afraid, Winyan Washte," he said, his voice a low reassurance. "We are safe here." But Emery knew that the safety they had built was as fragile as a spider's web in a storm. "It's him," she whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "I know it's him." Hinto didn't need to ask who him was. He had heard the story of her abandonment, a story she had shared with him one quiet winter evening, the words tumbling out of her in a torrent of long-suppressed pain. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of public affection. "If he comes," Hinto said, his voice hard as stone, "he will find that this is not the same woman he left in the desert." Liam did not come charging into the camp as they had expected. He was cunning his desperation, honing his cruelty to a fine point. He spent 2 days observing his rage growing with every glimpse of his new reality. He saw Emery no longer the pale, submissive wife, but a strong, capable woman, her movements sure and confident. He saw his sons, his blonde-haired sons, playing with the Lakota children, laughing in a language he didn't understand. And he saw Hinto, the man who had taken his place, the man who was raising his sons as his own. The sight filled him with a poison that was part jealousy, part righteous fury. He made his move at dawn on the 3rd day. He didn't ride in. He tethered his horse a mile away and crept towards the camp on foot, using the pre-dawn gloom as cover. He carried a new Henry rifle, a symbol of the power he believed he now wielded. His target was not the camp at large. It was the teepee he had identified as Hinto's, as Emery's. His plan was simple and brutal. Take the boys and run. If Emery came willingly, fine. If not, she was just another obstacle. The camp was just beginning to stir. The first tendrils of smoke were rising from the teepees. Emery was outside, stoking the morning fire. Hoka was still asleep inside, but Wanbli, always the early riser, was toddling towards the creek, chasing a butterfly. Liam saw his chance. He emerged from the tall grass, a menacing figure in the grey morning light. "Emery!" He called out, his voice a harsh rasp. Emery froze, the stick in her hand, falling to the ground. She turned slowly, her face draining of all colour. It was him. Older, gaunter, his eyes burning with a wild, dangerous light. It was the face from her nightmares. "Liam," she breathed. "I've come for my sons," he said, his gaze flicking past her to Wanbli, who had stopped and was now staring at this strange, loud man. "And for you. We're leaving." "No," Emery said, her voice trembling but firm. She instinctively moved to place herself between Liam and the teepee where Hoka slept. "This is our home. You have no place here." Liam laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're home with these savages. Don't be a fool, Emery. You're a white woman. You belong with your own kind, with your husband." "You are not my husband," she retorted, her fear being rapidly replaced by a cold, hard anger. "You ceased to be my husband the day you left us to die." At that moment, Hinto emerged from the teepee, awakened by the sound of their voices. He held his bow, an arrow nocked but not drawn. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury. "She is not going anywhere," Hinto said, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped to Emery's side, a silent, unmovable protector. Liam's eyes narrowed, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "This is between me and my wife, Redskin. Stay out of it." "She is not your wife," Hinto repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "And these are my sons. I am the one who gave them names. I am the one who has fed them and protected them. They are my blood now." "They have my blood!" Liam roared, his composure finally cracking. He raised the rifle, pointing it not at Hinto, but at Wanbli, who had started to cry, frightened by the shouting. "Call him off, Emery, or I swear to God I'll put a bullet in him." A collective gasp went through the camp as people emerged from their teepees, drawn by the confrontation. Time seemed to stop. Emery's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird. "Liam, no," she pleaded, taking a step forward. "Stay back!" he screamed, his eyes wild. But it was Wanbli who broke the standoff. Terrified, he turned and ran, not towards Emery, but towards Hinto. He stumbled and fell, but quickly scrambled up and wrapped his small arms around Hinto's leg, burying his face in the soft leather of his leggings. "Eta!" he cried, the Lakota word for father, a damning indictment of Liam's claim. The sight seemed to break something in Liam. The boy his own son had chosen. He had chosen the savage over his own father. The rejection was more than his fragile ego could bear. With a guttural scream of pure rage, he shifted his aim from the boy to Hinto. He never fired. In the split second that his aim shifted, Emery moved. She didn't scream or plead. She acted. With a cry that was part rage, part terror, she launched herself at Liam. She was not the weak, dying woman he had abandoned. She was a mother protecting her child, and she possessed a strength he could never have imagined. She slammed into him, her shoulder hitting his chest, knocking him off balance. The rifle discharged, the shot going wild, tearing a hole in the sky. They fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Liam, stronger but taken by surprise, struggled to bring the rifle to bear on her. But he was too late. Hinto, seeing his chance, let his arrow fly. It struck Liam in the shoulder, the force of it spinning him around. His scream of pain cut short as two other Lakota warriors fell upon him, disarming him and pinning him to the ground. The confrontation was over in a matter of seconds. Silence descended upon the camp, broken only by Wanbli's terrified sobs and Liam's pained groans. Emery pushed herself up, her body trembling, her knuckles scraped and bleeding. She rushed to Wanbli, scooping him into her arms as Wiyaka came out of the teepee with a crying Hoka. She gathered her sons to her, burying her face in their hair, their familiar scent, a reassurance that they were safe. Hinto walked over to where Liam was being held. He looked down at the man who had caused so much pain, his face a mask of cold contempt. He then looked at Emery, surrounded by her children and the Lakota women who had become her sisters. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unyielding strength. He had been right. This was not the same woman Liam had left in the desert. She had been forged anew in the crucible of the West, and she had found her home. The confrontation was over, but now a new choice had to be made. What to do with the man who was by law still her husband? The fate of Liam O'Connell was the subject of a solemn council. The elders Hinto and the other warriors gathered in the center of the camp, the setting sun casting long, somber shadows. Liam, his shoulder crudely bandaged, was tied to a post, a sullen and defeated figure. By the laws of the tribe, his actions threatening a child, bringing violence into the camp, were punishable by death. There was little debate among the warriors. Justice was simple and swift. But Hinto, the man with the greatest cause for vengeance, was silent. He looked not at Liam, but at Emery, who stood at the edge of the circle, her sons held tightly in her arms. This was her past, her demon. The final word, he felt, should be hers. He motioned for her to step forward. A murmur went through the assembled men, but they respected Hinto, and they parted to let her pass. She walked into the center of the circle, her gaze steady, her back straight. She had faced down her tormentor. She would not shy away from his judgment. "He is the father of your sons by blood." The eldest chief, a man named Sitting Bear, said, his voice heavy with gravitas. "But his heart is bad. He left you to the spirits of the plains. He came back not with love, but with a weapon. By our laws he has forfeited his life. But you are Winyan Washte. You are the mother of Wanbli and Hoka. What say you?" All eyes turned to her. Emery looked at Liam. Truly looked at him for the first time since the struggle. She saw not a monster, but a pathetic, broken man consumed by his own bitterness and failure. Killing him would be an act of rage, and she had seen enough of that to last a lifetime. Vengeance would not heal the scars he had left, nor would it secure her son's future. "To kill him," she began, her voice clear and carrying in the still evening air, "would make us like him. It would answer violence with more violence. That is not the way I want my sons to learn." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "He is a man with nothing. His spirit is already dead. Let the white man's world have him back. Banish him. Let him wander the land with the knowledge of what he threw away. Let his own emptiness be his punishment." Her words were met with a stunned silence, then a low murmur of assent. It was a judgment of profound wisdom, one that valued life and understood that some fates were worse than death. Hinto looked at her with a newfound awe and a deep, abiding love. She had chosen mercy over vengeance, strength over bitterness. They cut Liam free at dawn. Hinto gave him back his horse, a water skin, and a small pouch of dried meat. "You will ride east," Hinto commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If you are ever seen in this territory again, her words will not save you a second time." Liam, humbled and broken, did not meet his gaze. He looked only once at Emery, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Was it regret, shame, or just the hollow emptiness of his defeat? He said nothing. He mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure disappearing back into the world that had made him and that he had so miserably failed to conquer. Emery watched him go, not with hatred, but with a final quiet release. The last ghost of her old life was gone. As his figure vanished over the horizon, she felt two small hands tug at her dress. Wanbli and Hoka looked up at her, their blue eyes full of questions. She knelt and hugged them fiercely, the solid, living warmth of them chasing away the last of the shadows. Hinto came and knelt beside them, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. He looked at Emery, and in his eyes she saw not just the promise of a future, but the reality of a home forged not of wood and sod, but of shared survival, unexpected love, and the resilient bonds of a family created not by blood, but by choice. They had faced the fire, and they had emerged not scorched but stronger, their lives intertwined like the tough, steadfast roots of the prairie grass, ready to face the turning of the seasons together. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Wild West. The story of Emery Hinto and their sons is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find family in the most unexpected of places and to forge a new life from the ashes of betrayal. It reminds us that courage isn't just about facing down an enemy, but about choosing compassion in the face of hatred. If this story of resilience, love, and the complex tapestry of the American frontier moved you, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed past. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Let us know in the comments what part of Emery's journey resonated with you the most.